Hi everybody, I'm Bill Sharp, St. Andrews class of 68, and welcome to the Rocks and Razorbacks podcast. Here, we feature conversations with remarkable alumni, teachers, and administrators from both Middleton and St. Andrews high schools. This is a great way to share meaningful stories and keep our memories alive of growing up in West Ashland. Now, to today's host and guest.
Great. I'm here today with my brother Edward C. Fennell, better known as Eddie Fennell, maybe to the St. Andrews class of 68. He's here today, and he went on to be a long-time award-winning journalist at the Post Courier. Eddie, welcome.
Thank you. I remember starting junior high, of course, having left grammar school, and met lots of new friends, made lots of great new friends. Some of them I'm still friends with today. And of course, there were some quite interesting teachers too. It was quite an experience, and I kind of have to look back on my school years. It was a great time of change, even upheaval, nationally and internationally. For instance, until my senior year, we were not integrated. It was only in my senior year that we had about a dozen African Americans in the school. And before that, everything was lily white. And then internationally, the Vietnam War started and got going. You had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, the aftermath of the John F. Kennedy assassination. There was a great deal going on in the world and at home.
When you first walked through the doors of St. Andrews, what was it like for a young freshman? How was it like for you?
At the high school, I was really glad to be there. Through the 6th grade elementary school, I always walked to school, went to Albemarle Elementary. Starting with junior high, took the bus. And I know a lot of kids these days hate the bus, but we loved the bus. We had a great time. We probably didn't behave as well as the bus driver would have liked, but we had a great time. Met a lot of friends there too. A lot of lasting stories from those days.
From what I understand at St. Andrews, the senior lawn meant a lot to the seniors. Did you have any pros or cons experiences?
Personally, I can't say I really had any experiences with the senior lawn, but I remember when I was a senior that some of the underclassmen got onto the senior lawn, and some of the bigger guys in our class put them in the trash cans, which caused a reaction from the administration, and there were people who were punished and privileges were suspended, but nobody really got hurt, but it was a thing.
To me, going to school, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, is so different than today. How would you, from what you know of today's school system, how was it like back then?
Oh, well, I'll have to say this. At the time I started junior high, which would have been 63, basically the culture was still in the 50s. I mean, it was like Leave It to Beaver, right? Everybody had a home to go to, had 2 parents. There was a lot of discipline. You were expected to behave. You were expected to be home at dark, etc., etc. Then things started changing rapidly as the 60s set in. The Beatles came in 1964. I was one of the first kids at St. Andrews that decided not to get a haircut because I always had the butch crew cut. And I caught a lot of flack from teachers and administrators about having long hair. I was probably ahead of my time, though, proud of it.
What do you remember of that Sunday night on Ed Sullivan and then going into school the next day? What was that like?
Well, that was something else. As my cousin Sandy Rose lived with us. She's 2 years older than me. And for a week or more, she was talking about the Beatles. I had never heard of them. And she kept talking about how cute they were. And to me, that was like, if they're cute, they're probably not very talented. So she insisted that the whole family had to watch the Ed Sullivan Show. We didn't really watch the Ed Sullivan Show. I think we watched Lassie or whatever was on at the same time. But so we watched the Ed Sullivan Show, and I remember the Beatles came on first, and I was sitting there thinking like, this is going to be dreadful. And when they sang 3 songs, I was thinking like, this is weird. I don't hate them. Then they came on later on in the show, did some more songs. I thought, yep, they're pretty good. And they were on 3 Sundays in a row. And I think it was when they did the song Twist and Shout. That's when I became a Beatle fan for life. And one thing that struck me was they sang fast songs, they sang slow songs, they sang sad songs, they sang a lot of happy songs, but they always seemed to be having a good time on stage. And then they were getting chased by girls, and I thought, that sounds like a good life to have.
Let's go through the halls of St. Andrews again.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll give you the opportunity to talk about some people that made an impression on you, either in a positive sense or a negative sense. And I did the magic of editing, so I'm not worried about what you're gonna say.
Well, I wanted to say that we had the coolest principal I've ever heard of in a high school. Mr. Hester, his nickname was Fess, and even children would call him Fess, and he didn't object. But we had some of the meanest, grouchiest teachers I've ever seen, and one of them was Miss Hanson. You might censor that out, I don't care, but everyone knows who I'm talking about. Anyway, she was obsessive about giving out demerits. Example was, she would not close the door to her room. She would wait to see if any student came walking down the hall, and she would run out there, ask them if they had a hall pass, and if they didn't, she'd give them demerits. Most teachers didn't pay any attention to kids who might walk by during class, as long as they weren't disturbing it or making some foul noise or something. So anyway, and Miss Hanson also, I had a situation where I had a PE class. The bell would ring to end it. I was supposed to go to her room, sit there for 2 minutes, then another bell would ring, and I would go to lunch. Well, the PE instructor often did not call us in off the field in time to come shower or change clothes, whatever. Sometimes we'd be out there in the middle of a football game, the bell rings, you run to the gym, throw on your clothes, and I had to get to Miss Hanson's class. It was all the way across the campus. And often I would get there seconds before the bell would ring, even while the bell was ringing. Well, she told the class, if you sit down while the bell is ringing, you're late. You're not on time, and I'm going to give you demerits. Well, this one day, tried my best, but I ran to her class. My butt hits the seat as the bell is ringing. She runs over to me and said, "You were not here on time? You're playing hooky." I said, "What?" She said, "If you're not in your desk when the bell rings, you're playing hooky." I said, "Well, no, I wasn't playing hooky." She said, "Well, I'm going to double those demerits if you're going to argue with me." Well, I wasn't playing hooky. I was simply, if worse comes to worse, I was simply late. But as far as I'm concerned, I was saved by the bell. I got there before the bell stopped ringing. That wasn't good enough for her. So every time I opened my mouth, she said she was doubling the amount of demerits. So I said, "But Miss Hanson," and she said, "I'm doubling it again." I said, "But I'm doubling it again." So she ended up giving me about 10,000 demerits. She was a math teacher, so I guess she could calculate them. Anyway, so the bell rang, and I got up and left, and I went straight to Mr. Hester's office. I walked in there, and I told the secretary I had an emergency. I needed to see him. She said, "Go in." I went in and I said, Mr. Hester, and I didn't know how he was going to react to this. I said, Miss Hanson just gave me 10,000 demerits, and I swear I don't deserve them. I was expecting he would take her side. He said, we know. I said, what? He said, I understand. I said, but what? He pointed to his desk. There were two inboxes on his desk. One had about 2 sheets of paper in it. The other was about that thick in paper. He said, these are the demerits I got this week from all the other teachers. These are the demerits I got from Miss Hanson, the big pile. I said, well, what am I supposed to do? See, under our system, if you get 20 demerits, you're suspended for 3 days. I said, what am I supposed to do? She thinks I'm going to be suspended. He said, don't go to her room for 3 days. I said, okay, I can live with that. So I didn't. I went out and had an extra lunch period during her study hall, which was the class I was supposed to be there for. So at the end of the 3 days, I go back to her room. She proudly strolls over to me and says, well, I hope you learned something. I said, Miss Hanson, yes, I dearly did learn something. And everybody was snickering because they knew the truth.
That's a classic Eddie story from St. Andrews, being his youngest brother. I've heard a lot of these stories, just how accurate they are, truthful they are. Never know, but hey, guess what I got? I got our brother Jerry, who is actually Middleton class of 71, but a little bit younger than Eddie, followed Eddie in St. Andrews for like a couple years. And I got Jerry now. Jerry's on the phone from Greenville, Michigan. Hi, Jerry. How you doing?
I'm doing very well.
All right. So you've heard a lot of these stories from Eddie, but you also probably are able to witness things that that we were not able to see. So what is your take on the Hanson story and other classic Eddie stories from St. Andrews?
Well, they're very consistent with all the stories that he tells about St. Andrews. I came up 2 years behind Eddie, and I can testify that on the first day of school, when the teacher would be calling the roll of the class for the first time, when she would get to Jerry Fennell, she would pause and then say, are you related to Eddie Fennell? And I would kind of meekly say, yes, ma'am, I am. And then the teacher would say, 9 times out of 10, sit down, shut up, I don't want to hear a word out of you. And one year, the teacher, after doing that, looked at me and said, are there any more like you at home? And I said, yes, ma'am, I've got 3 behind me, 2 brothers and a sister. And the woman looked at the class and looked at me, and she said, thank God I'm retiring this year.
We were raised in the time where you would just play outside till it got dark. And then you go in and almost reluctantly eat dinner and do homework if you had it or if you're inclined to do it. Do you look back on those days fondly? We were lucky to live in that era.
Well, yeah, this was an era where, for most kids, you were expected to be home when those street lights came on. I think that's a good rule. It'd be nice to have kids following that rule now, because I know from experience that when you and your teenage friends are out wandering around at night, you can get into trouble and do things you wouldn't ordinarily do. We weren't bad kids, of course, but we had bags of fireworks and we were out to have fun. Our home was always neighborhood central. We were of 5 kids, and in the afternoons after school, each of us would have a friend or two over. So we had 10, 12, 15 kids over at the home at any given time. And I was usually the oldest of the bunch. And I usually ended up organizing a baseball game, a basketball game, a football game, even a golf frisbee, something like that, just to keep everybody busy and out of trouble. But I think as a family we did a lot to give kids a purpose, after school fun, instead of going out and wandering the neighborhood.
Oh yeah, years later, after growing up, I asked Mom, how could you put up with us making all that noise sometimes till midnight? And her answer was, we knew where you were. You knew what you were doing.
Yeah.
And that included like taking lights out of the garage and hanging them over the basketball court in tree limbs. And I was like, wow, the stuff we got away with. Definitely. Mm-hmm. So looking back at St. Andrews, who were some of your best friends, and how do those relationships through the years go? Are you still close with some? I mean, not opportunities arise all the time to make that possible, but some of your best friends in school.
Well, Val Gruno was one of my closest friends, and we've been in touch, but not for a little while now. And Daryl McMillan, I see him on Facebook all the time. Steve Tagg, one of my friends. Unfortunately, some of my better friends in high school are no longer with us. After I retired from the paper, I took a part-time job at the Sam's Club gas station. And ironically, I met a lot of my old high school buddies would come in there, driving their cars with their families. So, that was always the experience. Sometimes they'd look at me and say, "Don't I know you?" Yeah, some of them remembered me, and I couldn't remember them, but...
Have you gone to a few of the reunions through the years?
Yes, I went to the 50th. I guess that was in 2018. And odd thing, I walked in the room and I said, look at all those old people. I couldn't figure out what happened. But you know what? Everybody seemed to recognize me. And I'll have to admit, there were a few people I didn't readily recognize. But it was nice that people remembered me, for good or bad. I never felt like I was not in the in crowd in high school. I was maybe a nerd. I didn't drive a car, have a surfboard. I built rockets, and that didn't help me become part of the in crowd.
Somewhere along the way, you guys got incredibly brave and built these tree forts in our neighborhood, which was half homes and still half a forest, and we had bamboo forest and in our neighborhood. How did that happen? Now we're talking about mega high tree forts.
Yeah, well, most of it can be attributed to a kid named Mark. I don't know if I should say his last name or not. Should I?
Sure.
Mark Drolet. He was even as a young teenager, he was a genius at building things. I mean, we used to joke that he could build a radio out of a box of dirt. And he, in fact, did build radios. He would take like the cheap walkie-talkie you could buy at the dime store, and he would soup it up with better batteries and a few components here or there, and all of a sudden, it's a ham radio. We were talking to ham radios around the country, even out of the country. I built rockets and he built bombs. But when we moved to Old Town Acres, we were the last house on a dirt road, and it was surrounded by hundreds of acres of woods. It's all been developed since then, but it was just heaven for young teenage boys. We camped in these woods. We built our own hiking and biking trails back there. Mark in particular built tree houses, usually from wood that he was borrowing from construction sites, but he was so good at it. He had one particular tree house was over 100 feet high. It was between two huge pine trees. And I spent the night up there with him and other boys one night, and it was amazing. The view from there was incredible. And you'd feel the tree swaying at night, you know, like you were on a ship or something. But
how high do you think those days, back in those days? How high?
How high was that tree house? It was over 100 feet because we dropped a rope and measured it. Well, somebody called the FBI and reported an espionage treehouse in the woods. And the FBI actually came out there with automatic weapons. Mark and I were in the tree, and we came down, and they came out of the woods and surprised us. And they were very brutal about it. They said, "What's up in that tree, boy?" We told them nothing. And Mark said, "Go ahead, climb up there and look yourself if you don't believe me." And the man said, "I wouldn't go up there if there was a $50 bill waiting for me." Well, there happened to be a television crew, one-man television crew there with a camera, and the agents decided to leave, but they told us they were going to come back and cut the trees down. Well, the cameraman asked us a few questions, and we told him, you know, of course we're not into espionage. He wouldn't go up in the tree, but he let us bring his camera up in the tree. We hauled it up on the rope. We took that camera up there to the observation deck and did a panorama view, which they showed on TV that night. However, we noticed that when they pointed towards like the Navy base, they edited it out. Anyway, so it was on TV that night, and we were all famous for one day.
Well, the 60s were so huge with so many things, and I know that you were excited about a few things. One thing that comes to mind is rocketry.
I wanted to be the first man on the moon or Mars. I missed out on the moon. I guess I'm going to miss the Mars flight too. But when I was about 12, I decided to start my own rocketry program. But the only rockets available were like 4th of July type sky rockets. But NASA had Project Mercury to launch its men. I started Project Venus, and I used like paper cups to make a little capsule out of, got some sky rockets and bundled them together, captured like a cricket or a grasshopper, and launched them up into the sky that way. That was my first rockets. Later on, I was able to buy more scientifically made rocket engines and rockets, but I made my own rockets out of paper towel tubes and rug tubes and other things like that. My program culminated in a 6-foot tall rocket with a movie camera in the top of it. And this was an actual handheld Kodak Brownie movie camera that you had to wind up. And I set it into a capsule made out of a Clorox bottle. I had a pair of mirrors so that the camera pointed up, but it could look down as it took off. And the idea was when the parachute came out, the nose cone would fall away and the camera would be pointing out at the ground as it parachuted down. The problem was the first scanner went up very high in the sky, and the parachute tore because we'd never made anything so big or heavy as that and didn't realize it needed a better parachute. The camera itself crashed onto my neighbor's roof, punched a hole in it. The camera was crushed, but we actually got some usable film of the view as it took off. 6 months later, we launched Scanner 2 with a new camera, new engines, and the second stage never lit. And it came straight down onto the roof. Same roof. Same result.
Is it true the neighbor was in the attic?
No, he wasn't in the attic. He was in the house.
Oh, okay.
It was early on a Sunday morning, and he came running out of his front door, rolled across his lawn into his ditch, and covered his head. He told me later, when he calmed down, that he thought an airplane crashed on the house, and when he looked back and his house was still there, he thought God was punishing him for missing church for the first time in 6 months. It meant a lot to me, and maybe the reason why was I had a lot of friends who were into cars, like teenage boys are, and surfboards, and girls, and all of this stuff, and I really didn't have much of a social life outside home. But rocketry was my thing, and I saved my money. I got a newspaper route to earn some money. I used it to make those rockets, and I was pretty proud of it. In fact, we made a rocket that launched confetti, and we started bringing it to the St. Andrews High football games. And when the band was marching at halftime, we would fire this rocket from one of the corners of the field. It would go up over the field and then explode, and the confetti would come falling down on the band, and everybody would applaud. I never really asked permission, but nobody ever said I couldn't do it, right? Well, one Friday night game, we launched the rocket, and something went wrong. It didn't explode, the confetti. The rocket continued across the field and came down in the opposite corner where there was a large bucket of ice where they were selling drinks. And it stuck into the ice, and then it exploded. And it blew confetti all into the ice.
People were telling us for about a week after that their Coke tasted like rocket fuel at the game. Now, we got called into the principal's office. I did. Got called into the principal's office on Monday. And to my surprise, instead of getting suspended, they gave us permission to launch the rockets at the game. But they said, be a little more careful about the Coke stand. So we launched the rockets for several home games. And then one of the last games of the season, we launched the rocket, and the marching band was on the field. And they're, like state champion marching band. Very proud of the marching band. And the rocket went up, and it made a whistle noise when it took off. And half of the band players thought it was a drum majorette blowing his whistle for them to turn. And the other half ignored it. And it was chaotic on the field. People turned and bumped into people, and it was a mess. They had to stop the whole show. And again, I got called into the principal's office. And after that, they said, no, you can't do that.
When I was in the 7th grade, I was all about outer space and being an astronaut. That was it. And I kept these scrapbooks on space flight and etc. And then I got a newspaper route when I was 16 to help cover the expenses of my own rocketry program. Reporters came out and covered my launches, and I got very interested in how they do their job. They gather this information, they take pictures, they take all this information and these facts and boil it down into an interesting story to read. Plus, I watched all the space launches on television and saw the reporters covering that and interviewing astronauts and scientists and such. So that did get me interested in writing. And also the Beatles opened my eyes up to literature and poetry and saying things and feeling emotions in words. And in high school, I wrote some poems that were in the school literary magazine. At that time, I wasn't really interested in being a reporter. Bill Sharp worked for the school newspaper at the time. He ended up being a television reporter. But it was only, I went to college and I was put into calculus classes. I was not prepared for that. I tried geology. Again, it got back to labs and calculus and things. And everyone said that I should be a journalist anyway, so I finally succumbed and got into journalism. Glad I did. I didn't become an astronaut, but I interviewed several astronauts, and and NASA scientists, and so I feel a great background in science and space that I could use for stories like that.
Thanks for watching today's episode, and be on the lookout for additional episodes. If you'd like to be a guest or even a host in the Rocks and Razorbacks podcast, please let us know. We want the podcast to be the go-to place for cherished Middleton and St. Andrews memories. Don't forget, the Rocks and Razorbacks documentary geared for South Carolina ETV is in production, and we'd love your input and help with that as well. For now, go Rocks and, go Hogs. Well, you get it. Thanks.